And I'm delighted to pass over to Ralph Dahls, the head of Group Audit at Zurich, previously with RSA and Deloitte and Aviva, and critically for our event today, a member of the ECIA's Insurance Committee, who will have a vital role to play in supporting the profession navigate their way through the challenges of a changing regulatory landscape. So, Ralph, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you for hosting and facilitating a fascinating discussion. That was really great to listen into, and a topic that will be high on our list for a very long time from now on. So today I have the honor to facilitate a panel discussion on a hugely insightful recent paper from the ECIA. The paper was titled "The Impact of Recent Global Trends on internal auditing in the insurance industry." It was authored by Antonella Loffredo and James Fisher, who also will make up today's distinguished panel, and I will introduce them in a little bit more detail shortly. The content of the paper was based upon in-depth discussions amongst the ECIA committee. And it provides a hugely insightful, in-depth analysis of the macro trends that we saw recently, particularly in the last 2 years, accelerated by COVID, trends that impacted the insurance world and trends that impacted the internal audit world. It then looks to reflect on the purpose of internal audit, and against these macro trends, is the purpose still the right one, or do we need any changes within that? And then it starts digging deeper into the impact of new ways of working within insurance companies. And my favorite part, it really dives into the impact on the internal control systems. What risks are new? What do we need to be reflecting on? What are some of the unknowns that we might not be aware of at this stage? And then it looks at remote auditing and the pros and cons of that, but also very critically assesses where does it work and where does it not work, and then it nicely flows into the future of audit work. So from my perspective, an absolutely fascinating and insightful paper that has gone beyond and in more depth than I've seen other papers in this area. So if you haven't read it yet, and even following today's discussion, I would strongly recommend you to read it and share it within your respective organizations. As for today's session, it will be interactive. We'll be using Slido for some questions that we'll ask the audience or the various participants. And then we'll reflect on some of your views. We'll also have some time for questions from the audience at the end. And again, you can use Slido to post those. We'll take them at the end. And finally, both our panelists have kindly offered for any follow-up one-to-ones that you may want to have on the topic after today's session. So now let me turn to Antonella and to James. So Antonella has been since 2001 within Generali Group, has extensive experience with internal audit, and currently she's responsible for the unit that looks after audit knowledge management, communication, which includes audit methodology, internal and external communication, training initiatives, and any other development measures for the whole of the Generali internal audit group, which is about 400 people. Welcome, Antonella.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Ralph. Sorry.
And then James. James is the global head of internal audit practices at AXA. He has held that role since 2016, and in there he looks after methodology, quality assurance, reporting, governance, tools and data, and some global thematic audits if the first part wasn't enough for more than a day activity. And previously, James was at HSBC internal audit in various roles for about 8 years, and he started out as an IT consultant. So given that a lot of the macro trends will no doubt touch upon IT, James, we're interested in your perspectives on that as well. So welcome James as well. And as we start, maybe it would be interesting for the audience to hear a little bit around your views in terms of the biggest challenges for internal audit now compared to 2 years ago. And let's take that beginning and end point of view and share your insights on that. And Antonella, maybe you want to start off first with that.
Yes, with pleasure, Ralph. Thank you. So the biggest change, I would say that if we talk about the biggest change, we cannot mention the fact that internal auditors experience the same adoption of remote working as other departments. And this has been a really big change with a variety of consequences. For instance, a further resultant shift toward focusing on outcomes, on quality and productivity rather than on time spent, and heightened focus on communication, team management, and support. In this period, auditors had to make the most of digital tools, maximizing the opportunities of remote working, but at the same time managing its limits. I think that in this context, the biggest change and the biggest challenge has been to work in a situation where spontaneous access to people and to information was limited due to the remote working. And so in this context, there is a high risk of not being fully aware about what is happening in the company and hence missing changes in its risk profile.
Fantastic, and there's a lot in what you just said, and I think later on I'd probably like to unpack some of these elements a little bit more. But let's first give it back to or answer the same or ask the same question to James and get your perspective on that.
Yes, thank you, thank you, Ralph, and hello everybody. So I think the thing that's changed most over the last couple of years is probably the speed of change itself. So if we think back to early 2020, particularly in Europe, I think we were somewhat in denial about the possibility of a pandemic actually hitting home. I certainly remember that. And when things actually took off, the changes were dramatic and immediate. So it's an overnight change. Antonella's already touched on a number of the aspects, but I certainly remember everybody working from home. So from an audit perspective, that was a big change. But beyond audit, across the operations in the company, everybody was in the same lockdown position, and not only in one country, but globally. And the timing was different, but that impacts the way information flows around the company, between the different teams, between the different operational departments within a single process, and also the way information needs to be communicated to customers and the way customers interact with different companies. So I think operationally speaking, there are many new ways that the same challenges need to be tackled in a different way. And what that means is we need to be more flexible, more agile, and more open-minded in the way we do business. From a business perspective, I also think COVID has brought into stark relief existing risks around, say, the clarity of explicit coverage versus silent coverage. And although the risk existed, I'm not sure it was always factored into audit work or other control functions work. So the landscape has changed. It's exacerbated certain aspects, and others are still business as usual.
Very good. And it's interesting, if we look at the wide variety of new risks that emerged, and I think shortly we'll ask the audience to give their perspective on which ones they've seen that increased most significantly. But before we go there, James, I was interested in your perspective in terms of the changes. To what extent are these completely new, or to what extent have they simply accelerated what was already there and effectively brought the future a bit closer to us?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it depends on the specific topic. I think a lot of this is just an acceleration. So there were trends that pre-existed COVID. We're focusing on COVID at the moment, because it's still with us. And if you think back to a week ago, nobody was talking about Omicron, but you know, things aren't looking as quite as rosy or steady as they were at that time. So different risks are accelerating, different trends are accelerating, more digitalization, more automation in processes. All that has been brought together, if you will, just through these different ways of working. More video connections, more straight through processing, and more reliance on technology in general. So all that I'd categorize or qualify as an acceleration. But there are also new risks because fundamentally the way businesses are run is changing. We've had blurred boundaries between the office and home. We've got good experience over the sort of control framework that is brought to bear in an office space. You've got all the physical security, etc., secure storage of documents and what have you. And from an international dimension, with everybody working remotely from each other, it means that you can more easily share resource across borders, and all that has various regulatory or potentially tax implications. And I'm not sure we've thought those through to their logical conclusion at this point.
Yeah, some fascinating points and very important points you touch upon here. If we look at the ones that have effectively accelerated but were already here, to what extent, and maybe Antonella, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, to what extent would they therefore attest on the readiness, on the future readiness of organizations and maybe perhaps also audit functions? I think you're on mute still.
Sorry. Thank you, Ralph. I think that one of the risks that was already here was connected with operational risk, and in particular with IP and security risk. We know all of us know that cyber risk, it's really dangerous risk at the moment. Was before the pandemic, and we will see later on in detail, but the level of risk of IP and security risk increased a lot due to the fact, for example, that all the staff currently is working from home, and so there are a lot of measures that the company have to take in order to ensure an enhancement of the security measure while people is working from home. But this is just one of the risks. I like to mention also the impact for the workforce and for human capital. For example, this on the contrary is a risk that is increasing massively after the pandemic because from one day to the other, the COVID-19 triggered a revolution in the daily life of white-collar workers. And so impact on performance, result, collaboration, leadership, people development, professional traits and opportunities are just at the beginning of being understood. So I think that this is a big area of risk that with COVID-19 just exploded, and now we have just to start to understand its consequences.
And I think your last few words are really important. I think we're only at the start of understanding the implications, and we've got a really important role to play from an audit point of view to critically assess those new risks. What are they? How do they implement, or how do they impact the organization? And secondly, how do they impact the work that we undertake? But let's stay on the topic of the various risks, and perhaps this is an opportune moment to pose a question to the audience in terms of what they see are the most significant or the risks that increased most significant on the back of the COVID pandemic. I'll pause here for a moment to let everybody provide their responses. Numbers are still moving around. I'll give it a few more seconds. And then I'll turn to each of you to get your perspective on the views from the audience. Right, I think the numbers are settling. Seen as the biggest increase, operational risk, including cyber and human capital, which is interesting because we already mentioned it was already on the radar, but clearly it has accelerated quite significantly. That's a very clear number one. And then I think we've got a group which is fraud, business model changes, to a slightly lesser extent, social and financial risks. Antonella, do you want to provide your perspectives on these results and how did they link into the views that you articulated in the paper?
Yeah, sure. I'm not surprised about the result. If I would have to vote, I would vote for operational risk and human capital. As I said, operational risk increased a lot with the consequences that still are not clearly measured. I think that having all the people working from home, changing completely the way of working of a company, and the risk connected with this still have to be understood. I also think that company most of the time were not prepared to manage that risk from one day to the other, because as I said, the staff moved to work from home one day to the other, no? So without any preparation in advance, and so most of the company has to take a lot of measure in a hurry, like activation of business continuity plans, like a significant enhancement of their IT infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And then I would like also to mention, and it is one of the options most voted, also a really significant impact for the business model, where most of the insurance company had to do a big step toward digitalization of distribution activities, of claim management, and other client interaction points. And as you know, change the business model includes a lot of risk that needs to be measured and monitored and managed in some way.
Very good, thank you. James, your perspective?
Yeah, no, I agree with Antonella. No, only
joking. As usual.
Yeah, always. I'm similarly unsurprised that operational risk came out top. I think it's always been obvious that if you fundamentally change the way people have to work, you are exposing yourself to just new things that people haven't thought about. There are more opportunities for things to go wrong. Similarly, I think fraud was up there, and in fact it was on the top for quite a while. I think internal fraud, because people are on their own, there is greater opportunity for that to occur, and therefore companies need to be a bit more attentive to that. And external fraud, again, we've seen an upswing in things like phishing attacks, etc. So that's clearly key. I won't talk about the business model changes, but what I was surprised by is that societal risks were quite low, because my read on the situation is that society at large, so the customers, investors, and even governments have had a change in the way they view the role of insurers for keeping society running. Governments haven't got bottomless pockets. They've invested a lot in various subsidy schemes where businesses had to close, and the expectation was that insurers pick up the rest. Now, that wasn't necessarily factored into the way insurance policies were written, and more particularly, it is a governmental decision to close various businesses, various sectors, and expecting the insurers to pick up on a government decision becomes very political very quickly. So I suppose, I'm not giving any answers here, but I was surprised that those societal or conduct expectations didn't come out higher.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think on a couple of points, just elaborating, because I think in the paper itself, you give some really interesting examples already of potential fraud risk. And for the ones that follow the newspapers, I think some of them already materialized in a variety of organizations. Can you touch a little bit upon those fraud risks, James?
Yeah, so I suppose in effect, what we're saying is teams have been split up. You have less direct supervision. We're focusing on outcomes, etc., and it is easier for things to slip through the net. So from an internal perspective, you can just get away with stuff that you couldn't previously, because there isn't the same proximity you had with the team. You haven't got somebody always looking over your shoulder. In other specific examples, slightly beyond fraud, it's not quite the same, but the physical environment in which you work is critical in, say, fund management activities, and market abuse or manipulation of share prices is also something which, under normal circumstances, has some very tight controls around in terms of managing the information, people who have access to market sensitive information, etc., and all that, for the purposes of business continuity, means that it's just a much more loose environment that we work in. And I think Antonella touched on it earlier. When companies activate their business continuity plans, it's a survival question, and when the choice is keep the business running or make sure that everybody's doing exactly what they should be doing, then sometimes shortcuts are taken, and that just exposes companies to fraud risk.
Yeah, it's very interesting, your point. I think that, we've seen examples emerging recently in the press from somebody that was picked up on insider trading and effectively was making trades, personal trades when trading. And I think that the interesting element was that the individual was in the office and there was nobody else in the office. So it's almost the world upside down. And another one where I think a partner had access to systems. So you've got the risk of other people accessing data from different environments, which otherwise wouldn't be possible. You mentioned some of the. I'd like to turn to Antonella on this one. You mentioned that business continuity mode was switched on. People were kind of in survival mode for a while. So to what extent did you see these elevated risks? To what extent were they on the radar, and were they picked up on by organizations, in particular audit functions, in the beginning? And where do you see their focus shifting towards at this point in time? Was it first on business continuity and making sure that the basics were there? Are we now starting to think about what the new fraud risks are? How do you see that? What did you see the response of the insurance industry and internal audit, and how do you see that evolving?
Yes. So in the paper, we did a recap of which have been the measure taken by the insurance company and also by the internal audit department to face the crisis. So as a first reaction, insurance companies, as I said, activated their own business continuity plan, shift a large part of the staff to remote work, and then we saw also a significant enhancement of IT infrastructure, network capacity, digital tools. Many efforts have been put also in finance with a focus on liquidity and cash management and update of business plan. In underwriting, we saw a review of contract condition and sometimes a removal of the silent covers. As regard the product area, we saw an innovation and a revamp of insurance product in order to meet client need and to protect the company from the accumulation of the risks. And then last but not least, a really, really big step toward digitalization, as I said before, digitalization of distribution activities and all the other client interaction points. And the company are still working a lot on this. Generally still working a lot on this and did a really incredible journey in the last 2 years to achieve these objectives. In this context of change, which has been the reaction of audit department, well, the reaction has been quite immediate and quite strong, in particular to face the crisis at the beginning in 2020. So first of all, I think that most of the internal audit department have updated their audit risk assessment. Consequently, they have reviewed their audit plan and also their plan times frame. And risk assessment and audit committee have been approved by the audit committee during the year. Then we saw more flexibility compared to the past, more flexibility in two directions. The first is an extension of the planned implementation dates for all or for some of the outstanding issues and related corrective actions. And the second way is that there's been more flexibility with the deadline assigned to the business for answering draft report and providing action plans. And then, last but not least, many internal departments provided temporary support to the other business function to face the first phase of the crisis. In addition to all of these changes, internal audit, as we said many times, experienced the same adoption of remote working as the other department, with a lot of specific consequences that I think that today we will discuss in detail one by one that are really, really relevant.
Very good. And particularly the latter points that you touch upon really go to the heart of what is internal audit there for. And do you change the role of internal audit in this type of crisis situation or in this type of environment? And in the paper, you reflect on the purpose of internal audit. Based upon what you've seen, does it need to be changed? Does it still hold up? Or do we need to reflect on it slightly differently on a go-forward basis? And maybe James, you want to provide some thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ralph. I'm just going to wave my arms around because the lights have gone off in the office. They're obviously not used to people actually being in, but there we go. Well, it's a healthy question to ask ourselves, isn't it? Does this affect the purpose of internal audit? So it's an interesting question. I've got a dry response and then I'll elaborate on that. But first of all, I'm going to bore you all with a few definitions from the IIA about our purpose. So hopefully you've all got a cup of coffee or possibly something stronger while you listen to this. So the IIA says that internal audit's purpose is, I've got it on paper, I don't know it by heart, an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity designed to add value and improve an organisation's operations. It helps an organisation accomplish its objectives by bringing a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control and governance processes. It also defines assurance, and it gives in the core principles a few added dimensions to what lies behind this purpose. I'm not going to go through them all, but I do want to highlight 4. And these are all bullet points. Communicates effectively, provides risk-based assurance, is insightful, proactive and future-focused, and promotes organisational improvement. So hopefully that's familiar to everybody on the call, certainly is to me. But the point I'd like to make is that those definitions are all encompassing. They say what the role of internal audit is. They give the position within a company. Our assurance activity has to be independent in order for it to be objective. It has to be objective because our opinions are supposed to be useful. And if they're not objective, they're biased. If they're biased, they're part of the problem. So if we want to add value to a company, we have to provide that independent and objective assurance. So far, so good. The fundamentals hold true. I don't think these trends affect our raison d'etre or our purpose. But I would just like to go back to those principles because as we've seen various risk exposures accelerating, I think the nature and the way we go about adhering to these principles is changing. But nonetheless, the principles are actually, I'd say, reinforced or strengthened by these trends. Communicates effectively, that was the first one. When you're not all in an office together, communication becomes even more important. You need to know what other team members are doing. When you're talking to the business, you need to be able to approach them. You need to be able to have a dialogue. You need to be able to have that continuity. You can't just go and sit on somebody's desk until they give you an answer. You have to be a little bit more sensible, and so communication is definitely key. Is insightful, proactive, and future focused. If we say that the risk landscape is evolving and that evolution is accelerating, then it's even more important now than it ever has been to be future focused. So we can't be satisfied to say, you know, what happened last year, let's go and review these transactions from, you know, such and such a period. We have to consider whether the processes and controls that exist are the right ones, whether they can hold up to stressed situations that we wouldn't necessarily have anticipated, and whether the business has its eyes open to the way the market generally is changing. So a slightly long answer, but in essence, no, we conclude that the purpose of internal audit isn't changing, and that the judgment that auditors need to exercise as part of their activity in order to produce these opinions, it remains the core of auditing.
Very interesting insights, and it does beg the follow-up question: to what extent do you see audit functions actively reflecting on, okay, the purpose will stay the same, but how we go about things and how we exercise the judgments needs to evolve? Yeah, and clearly there are two components. It is the how, because the organization itself has changed. You know, we might have different type of risks that we were not aware of, but also the how we go about things as an audit function and working hybridly, etc. And what can we not pick up on? Where do you see the audit profession within the insurance industry on that journey? To what extent are these questions being asked, debated, etc.? And what do we need to do to collectively strengthen our position there?
Well, I think everybody is asking themselves that question. and you know that within the ECIIA that question's been raised, and this paper is part of the response to that. It doesn't give all the answers, and we don't pretend that we give all the answers, but it does encourage and prompt that sort of self-reflection, so that we don't just bury our heads in the sand and carry on as if nothing had changed. So even though the purpose is the same, we've all been obliged to change the way we work, and not just within an audit, but in the business departments being audited. They're also coming under their own stresses and strains. We need to accommodate that. And I suppose I think the biggest challenge is recognizing how evidence may change, because we used to be able to just sit down next to somebody and look at their screen while they walked through what they actually do, open a drawer, get out a folder, give us a piece of paper, etc. And all of that becomes more complicated. So we need to be more self-aware of, or aware in fact, of the limits that we're now exposed to, and how those processes have fundamentally been affected by these changes, and build that into the way we consider the evidence.
Yeah, it's certainly elements that we're at the moment, strongly discussing within Zurich, to truly understand what it means to work in a hybrid way. What does it mean in terms of the new risks, but also, most auditors will know that some of the big ticket issues that they found in the past were because of, corridor chats or little leads that they picked up here and there by just, feeling themselves around the culture, not being able to, or even just simply in the kind of business analysis or planning phase when you have those open discussions with management. And there's a big question in terms of how do we still have the benefits, and how do we create that in the right way. And one of the things that we've been picking up or discussing on is, if we work in a hybrid way, do we need to ask auditees to come into the office when we're auditing them, just to be able to have that face-to-face contact? I think you're right. They're all questions that are being asked, very important questions that we need to be asked, I think it's making sure that we don't end up a few years from now and have big significant misses on our watch, and that's what we need to reduce. And I think we need to do that collectively as a profession. On the flip side, there are clearly also a lot of positives in the hybrid working and the working from home, and perhaps Antonella, because I think the paper sets out a really good number of strengths as well. Perhaps you want to elaborate a little bit on those and provide your reflections on those to the audience.
Yes, sure. So the opportunities and the benefits of remote working are huge if we are able to manage its limit. For example, I would like to start from the opportunities of a largely remote workforce that include that geographical resourcing becomes less important. The skills of a global workforce can be easily leveraged to optimize resourcing and indeed hiring beyond the border of a particular location, and this is great. This can be beneficial both for long and short-term assignment, and obviously anyway the local situation, the knowledge of local situation, local condition, regulation, and language need to be ensured. But this can be really an incredible lever. Then remote work, when we talk about remote work with a reduction in commuting and travel times to distant location, remote work can also represent a significant saving of time, potentially translating into increased efficiency and productivity, and sometimes in a better work-life balance. In particular for audit, remote auditing can offer valuable opportunities to manage costs more flexibly, to reduce its travel expenses, and to optimize how audit skills are deployed. a better use of skills in the most appropriate ways will lead to a better coverage of the associated risks. I think that some audit or some part of audit, such as data-intensive analysis, can be managed without the need of an extended physical interaction with auditees. If these activities are adequately identified and planned, I think they can offer increased value for investment when being less bound by the time constraints of a traditional on-site auditing. These, I think, are really, really important benefits.
Agreed. James, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it all. Better use of skills. Clearly, that's an excellent opportunity. I think at the moment we've got experienced auditors, and they gain that experience whilst being on the ground. So we just need to be a little bit careful about how the new auditors gain an equivalent level of experience. And maybe just a quick comment on hybrid working, as you mentioned earlier, Ralph, and thinking, do we need an audited team to be, in the office so that we can sort of recreate the old way of auditing? I think we just need to be a little bit careful about not making that artificial, because if their actual activities aren't undertaken in that way, then we'll get a false impression if we've sort of engineered that. But it's a very good question, and I'm not saying we've tackled it fully at AXA yet. But I think hybrid is a struggle that everybody needs to kind of work their way through. And if we are just on the phone all day, in the end, it doesn't really matter where you are. So what's the point of an office?
Yeah, and I think the dimensions, in the office or in person, but adding the formal versus informal, and realizing that that if we over-engineer the home, it becomes too formal, and we also don't get the insights that we truly want. Yeah. That's going to be interesting, and we'll only know. I mean, now we're still in a situation where most of audit functions will have strong relationships with management. At least the majority of the audit functions will have been there for the last few years. The individuals in the audit function similar for management, so relationships are there. But in a go-forward basis, if you have to re-establish those relationships and create those informal contacts, it will only become more complicated. And I think we have to very purposely think about how we build those informal relationships over time, and how do we not miss out on that. And I think the other point that both of you are mentioning around bringing in new people, right, and making sure that, in a way, an audit function still has an apprentice type purpose, and how do we bring those people in, and how do we get auditors, how do we train them in a way that they're able to see what is not there, not just what is there. And that's difficult when you audit from home, and when you don't have that constant interaction with senior people that ask slightly different questions and learn from that. And I think that, to go back to some of the earlier points around cost pressure, and you mentioned it, Antonella, but I was interested in what extent do you see that audit functions were and moving to hybrid ways of working, changing, and we're therefore a little bit more efficient, we're able to take some cost out. To what extent is the dialogue evolving with management to push back on that and said, well, actually, we now need to start being considerate of the risks of us working from home, the risks that we have in a hybrid way of working in the organization, and not being too much on the happy drug of, we can audit from home and it will all go well, and we don't need to travel, etc. Right? And how do we, maybe a few words on that kind of conundrum would be fascinating.
Yeah, I think that we should find the right measure. I definitely think that an hybrid model could be the best solution, because for sure working from home implies a big save of cost, for sure, if we think not only save of time, but also for people like me. I'm a commuter, and so I test on myself how many hours per week I can fully dedicated to work, instead losing time commuting myself. But really also significant save of cost. Let's think which were the costs we spend to travel abroad, everywhere, especially in the big group like Generali is. So for sure, I think that remote working bring to us something good, something that we have to use in order to improve our productivity, our effectiveness, and this is absolutely valid for me. But we cannot forget the risk of an extensive remote work, and for me, it's really, really high. This risk, especially being an auditor. For example, you were mentioning the learning. For me, this is absolutely fundamental point for auditors, because more than other profession, due to the reliance on professional judgment, internal audit leverages on the job learning as a primary level for individual development, particularly for those just starting out. This is because becoming a good auditor requires not only a deep knowledge of business processes or audit techniques, but also and especially the competencies to demonstrate authority, credibility, ethical conduct, and so on and so forth. And these are not learned in a classroom context, but developed through observing others and working together in person. So working in close contact with experienced colleagues enable junior staff to learn the everyday behaviors, and such exposure is absolutely limited working remotely, since all the interactions are planned to some extent. And so in my view, remote working, there is absolutely limited opportunity to truly shadow someone or observe first-hand working practice. And this is something that an internal audit department, a chief internal audit cannot forget when deciding how to organize the work for his team in a hybrid mode. So I think it's important that auditors have time to spend together in office and have the possibility, especially the young colleague, to shadow experienced colleague and to learn, simply shadow their behavior. This is fundamental in my view.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. And similarly, the interactions with the business and the business areas that they audit, right? Because some of us might have the luxury to work in a monoline insurer with one system and one infrastructure, etc. But I think probably the majority for us, know that insurance companies are notorious for having grown and developed through their M&A activities, and systems are bolted on to each other with manual workarounds, etc. And for an auditor to be able to just step in, do a walkthrough, understand how data flows work, etc. It's in my book, it's very difficult to do that in a remote way. So yeah, there are lots of areas that we need to bring together. But I do see that it also provides opportunities for experience and new auditors to work much closer together, and it's kind of the new ways of working kind of broke through some of those boundaries that we might have had a little bit more in the past. Before I turn to questions from the audience, and please post some more if you have any. Any key points for the audience to consider in terms of where you see the future evolving based upon some of the challenges that you've been highlighting? Where do you see it moving in the next in the next couple of years? James, maybe you want to kick off.
Yeah, so I think we've probably touched on most of the
topics.
Of things,
right?
Yeah. I think that team cohesion part and the personal development, onboarding new staff, understanding what the company culture is, and being able to join those dots, having that corridor talk, as you mentioned, it's just not feasible if you're purely remote, and when it's hybrid, when you're in the office, maybe nobody else is, and so you don't get the same level of interaction. So audit teams need to consider what they can do to compensate for those things. Now, you've got learning paths, coaching, mentoring, etc., around the development areas. In terms of audit delivery, though, I think audit teams need to make full use of agile techniques. Just being open to and aware of changes so that they can react to the circumstances within an individual audit assignment, and more broadly speaking across the plan, because even though there isn't that sort of water cooler chat anymore, heads of audit should still be plugged into the right forums and exposed to those strategic discussions, which will allow you to sort of focus your efforts on the areas that the company will have the most risk in the future years.
And potentially on the audit work itself, being even more skeptical than we normally are, and being properly demonstratively skeptical, making sure that we understand that data properly comes from source, etc., because some of those things are much more difficult to check than we would have been able to do otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. The lineage becomes critical. Yeah.
Exactly. Antonella, any final reflections on the midterm?
Well, what I think personally is that a balance or a hybrid model will prevail between physical and remote working, with possibly greater geographical dispersion. I think the company are beginning to understand the benefits and limits of this new way of working models, and also audit is beginning to understand. I think that audit should adapt its way of working to best suit the model deployed by the management. I think that the internal audit should not be preemptive such changes, instead being sufficiently flexible to accommodate the changing circumstances, while remaining really closely associated with stakeholders. I think that precise and timely information is key for auditor, especially for punctual, high quality risk assessment, for an approach of prevention, and for its advisory role. That's why, in my view, in-person interaction are and will continue to be a key part of audit work, and of building a fruitful relationship, both needed to provide effective assurance and also to add value.
Thank you. That's really good points. And for me, what really resonates is the making sure that we follow what the company is doing, understanding how the company's operating model evolves, what they do from a working from home point of view, hybrid point of view, deeply reflecting as a function of what that means from a risk point of view, from an internal control point of view, and then making sure that we adapt, not just whether we work hybrid or not, but also the tools, techniques, how we audit, etc., to minimize ultimately the risk that we miss anything significant, and making sure that we're here to keep the business properly safe. And that's much easier said than done. But I think you've created a hugely insightful paper, which is only, in my book, only the start of a debate, but a very, very important one. And yeah, I would strongly recommend this topic to be high on the agenda of all audit functions, and seek out both of you as people wish to do so. So I'm conscious of time, and I given that I've moved to Switzerland, I've learned not to overrun very quickly. So I know there's one or two questions from the audience, but on that basis, once again, really big thank you, Antonella, and big thank you, James. Really insightful and a fantastic paper, and I'll hand over to Mr. License.